Celestial Station hung in the void like a promise someone had forgotten to keep. From her viewport aboard the transport shuttle, Princess Serena watched it grow from a distant glimmer to a sprawling monument of chrome and crystal, its observation domes catching starlight and scattering it into prismatic halos. The station orbited Telos 4, a moon so deliberately unremarkable that it had been chosen as neutral ground precisely because no one wanted it. She supposed that was fitting. No one particularly wanted her here either. The shuttle's docking clamps engaged with a metallic groan that resonated through the hull, and Serena rose from her seat with practiced grace. Behind her, Lord Vastron, her father's military advisor, adjusted his ceremonial sash with the careful attention of a man who knew appearances were all they had left. His ears, as elongated and delicately pointed as her own, twitched slightly, a nervous gesture he probably didn't realize he was making. "Your Highness," he said quietly, "the king sends his regrets again that he could not attend personally." "Of course he does," Serena replied, smoothing the deep blue fabric of her formal gown. The garment had cost her kingdom's treasury more than she cared to admit, all for a gathering where she would be carefully, politely ignored. A minor border dispute suddenly requiring his immediate attention. How convenient. Vastron had the decency not to argue. They both knew her father had sent her because the Galactic Summit was important enough that the Caliph system needed representation, but not important enough, in his estimation, to justify a king's time. "Send the princess. Let her practice at politics. She can't do much damage." The airlock cycled open with a pneumatic hiss, releasing a wave of recycled atmosphere that smelled faintly of ozone and the particular metallic tang that suggested 100 different species breathing requirements being simultaneously accommodated. Celestial Station's environmental systems were marvels of engineering, constantly adjusting temperature, pressure, and chemical composition in different sections to keep everyone from suffocating, freezing, or spontaneously combusting. Serena had read that maintaining the Great Hall alone required enough processing power to run a small planetary defense grid. All that computational effort so that beings who could barely tolerate each other's existence could sit in the same room and argue about trade routes. She stepped into the main concourse and immediately felt the weight of her own insignificance. The corridor stretched in both directions, its walls a flowing mixture of transparent aluminum and some sort of adaptive metal that shifted colors based on proximity. Delegates moved past in clusters, the towering, crustacean-like representatives from Terminus Prime clicking along on legs that sounded like wind chimes. A group of Vrex Confederation ambassadors, whose scaled skin reflected the corridor lights in oil-slick patterns. What appeared to be a silicon collective envoy that looked like an ambulatory crystal formation, wearing a translation device. No one looked at her. She was simply part of the traffic, another minor royal from another forgettable system. "This way, Your Highness," Vastron murmured, consulting his datapad. "Registration is in Section 7, then we'll proceed to your assigned quarters." Registration proved to be an exercise in automated humiliation. The attendant, some sort of biomechanical construct that existed at the intersection of organic and machine, processed her credentials with the enthusiasm of a device counting inventory. Name, system of origin, diplomatic status, quarters assignment, meal preferences adjusted for biology. The construct didn't make eye contact, which was difficult since it didn't appear to have eyes, just a sensory array that swept across her like she was being catalogued. When it handed her an access chip encoded with her schedule and security clearance, she noticed her authorization level was coded green. She'd glimpsed a hegemony delegate receiving a gold chip. Apparently even the security clearances had a hierarchy. The quarters were adequate, which somehow felt worse than if they'd been terrible. A sleeping chamber with gravity and atmosphere controls, a small sitting area, a cleaning station that promised to accommodate most carbon-based biology. The walls were the same adaptive metal as the corridors, currently displaying a neutral beige that suggested the room had no idea what to do with her. Vastron assured her he would be in the adjacent attendant's suite if she required anything, then retreated with visible relief. Even her own advisor seemed uncomfortable in her presence here, as though her irrelevance might be contagious. Serena stood in the center of her temporary home and felt the enormity of the next 2 weeks settle over her like a shroud. The summit's schedule was packed with sessions, debates, negotiations, social functions, each one an opportunity to be professionally overlooked. She thought about her father, probably relieved to have avoided this, returning to whatever genuinely pressing matter kept him home. She thought about her brother, who would have been sent if he weren't still finishing his military training. She thought about herself, standing alone in a beige room on a station full of people who would struggle to remember her name. The opening banquet began at 1800 station time, which corresponded to absolutely nothing on any actual planet, but gave everyone a shared temporal framework to complain about. Serena arrived exactly on time, which she immediately realized was a mistake. The truly important delegates arrived fashionably late, making entrances. She handed her invitation chip to another biomechanical construct and was directed to table 47, which was located in what could generously be described as the geographical center of social irrelevance. The Great Hall lived up to its name in the way that made Serena feel correspondingly small. The ceiling arched overhead in a dome of actual crystalline material from the mines of Xandros, transparent enough that the stars beyond were visible, giving the impression of dining in open space. Tables radiated out from a central platform in concentric rings, each one supporting place settings that automatically adjusted for the physiology of whoever sat there. A methane breather got a sealed environment bubble. A silicon-based entity got a surface that wouldn't react with their chemistry. Serena got standard plates and utensils because her people were boringly compatible with most oxygen-breathing species. Table 47 held 5 place settings. She was the first to arrive, which meant she had the privilege of watching the other seats remain empty as delegates found their assigned tables and promptly began networking with anyone but her. A server, this one actually organic, a young Talarian whose skin shifted through shades of purple to indicate attentiveness, delivered the first course, a bioluminescent broth that glowed faintly blue. Serena thanked her in standard, and the server looked momentarily surprised that anyone at this table had bothered with courtesy before moving on. The banquet proceeded in waves. Courses arrived and were cleared with mechanical efficiency while around her. Conversations bloomed like flowers she wasn't invited to smell. She caught fragments, trade negotiations, military alliances, gossip about which ambassador had insulted which delegate at the last summit. To her left, 3 tables over, she could see the hegemony contingent holding court, their table crowded with visitors paying respects. To her right, the Vrex Confederation ambassadors were entertaining a rotating parade of smaller systems hoping to curry favor. And at table 47, Princess Serena of Calith sat alone, watching her bioluminescent soup stop glowing as it cooled. She had just decided that leaving early might be less humiliating than staying when a voice said, "This seat taken." Serena looked up and found herself meeting the eyes of a human male who looked like he'd been on his feet for approximately forever. His diplomatic jacket, Earth's delegation wore dark blue with gold piping, was slightly rumpled. His dark hair was disarranged in a way that suggested he'd been running his hands through it, and he was smiling at her with the kind of tired warmth that suggested he'd just escaped something tedious and was hoping for better luck here. "I know," she managed, surprise making her stumble over the simple word, "Please." He dropped into the chair beside her with a sigh of relief that seemed entirely genuine. "Thank you. I've been mediating a dispute for the last 3 hours, and I'm fairly certain both parties now hate me equally, which I'm told is the sign of successful diplomacy." He extended his hand in the Earth custom. Fin Merrick, cultural attaché, Probably should have introduced myself before sitting down, but honestly I just needed to sit somewhere before I fell over. She took his hand, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers. Serena. Princess Serena of the Caliph system. Oh damn sorry, Your Highness, Your Majesty, I never remember the proper forms. Serena is fine, she said, and meant it more than she'd meant anything in days. Serena it is. He glanced at the table's emptiness, popular seating area. Despite herself, she felt her mouth twitch toward a smile. Apparently not. Their loss. I'm excellent company. Mediocre at formal dinners, but excellent company. He noticed her cooling soup and flagged down a passing server. Could we get a fresh round here? And whatever the second course is, because I missed the first one entirely while explaining why calling someone's proposal adequate can be a deadly insult in 12 languages but a compliment in 6 others. The server, perhaps startled by being addressed as an actual person, nodded quickly and hurried off. Finn turned his attention back to Serena with the kind of focus that suggested he was actually interested in what she might say next. So, he said, settling into his chair like they were old friends catching up, tell me about Caliph. I'm embarrassed to admit Earth's briefing materials on your system were basically exists, stable government, nice people probably. We're still working on our galactic geography. And just like that, for the first time since arriving at Celestial Station, Princess Serena felt something shift. Someone was looking at her, actually looking at her, as though she mattered. The morning session on interstellar shipping regulations had been designed, Serena suspected, as some sort of endurance test for consciousness itself. She sat in the tiered amphitheater that served as Summit Chamber 3, watching a holographic display cycle through what had to be the 900th subsection of tariff code adjustments, and wondered if this was how civilizations actually ended, not with warfare or catastrophe, but with everyone simultaneously dying of boredom during a presentation about docking fee standardization. Beside her, Finn was taking notes on his datapad with the determined focus of someone who knew that if he stopped moving his hands, he might actually fall asleep. They'd gravitated toward each other naturally when the morning sessions began, Serena arriving early out of habit and Finn appearing moments later with 2 cups of something that approximated coffee and the greeting. I come bearing stimulants, and the hope that today involves fewer discussions about whether beige is offensive. Any success on that front? She'd asked, accepting the cup. We've reached a compromise. The Tellarian delegation has agreed to consider beige contextually acceptable, and the Vrex have agreed to stop referring to it as the color of surrender and weak digestion. I'm calling it a win. Now, 3 hours into the session, that coffee was a distant memory, and the Vrex ambassador was explaining, in excruciating detail, why the current formula for calculating hyperspace lane tolls discriminated against species whose ships had to travel at slower than optimal speeds due to biological limitations of their crews. The hologram showed a 3-dimensional graph that somehow managed to make mathematics look boring, which Serena hadn't thought possible. Finn's stylus had stopped moving. She glanced over and saw he'd written on his datapad, "If I start snoring, please claim it's a human meditation technique." She pressed her hand to her mouth to suppress a laugh, which came out as an undignified snort that earned her a curious look from the crystalline accord observer 2 rows down. Finn's shoulders shook silently. The Vrex ambassador droned on, something about coefficient adjustments and proportional burden distribution. Serena felt her attention sliding away like water off glass, and then an idea struck her, sharp and clear enough to cut through the fog of tedium. She leaned toward Finn and whispered, "The Caliph system has been running independent asteroid mining operations for 60 years. We had to develop our own shipping protocols because the major trade routes don't service our region." Finn's head turned toward her, eyebrows raised. Meaning we've already solved most of these distribution problems on a small scale. Variable speed accommodations, flexible scheduling, shared resource allocation. We couldn't afford to discriminate against slower ships because we needed every transport we could get. Something shifted in Finn's expression, a sharpening of attention that reminded her he wasn't just a friendly face, but an actual diplomat who understood when something useful had just been said. You should mention that. I should what? During the open commentary period, they're not going to ask your opinion, but you're allowed to offer it. He gestured at the chamber around them. That's the whole point of this exercise, supposedly. Serena felt her stomach tighten. Speaking up meant drawing attention, and attention meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant everyone would see exactly how little her kingdom mattered in the grand scheme of galactic politics. But Finn was looking at her with something like expectation, as though he genuinely believed she had something worth contributing. The Vrex ambassador finally concluded his presentation with what sounded like either a summary or a threat. The translation was unclear. The session moderator, a being whose species Serena couldn't identify beyond, vaguely reptilian and extremely tired, announced the open commentary period in a tone that suggested it rarely expected anyone to use it. Finn nudged her ankle with his foot under the table. Serena pressed the activation stud on her seat's communication panel before she could reconsider. A soft chime indicated her request to speak, and the moderator's nictitating membranes flickered in what might have been surprise. The chair recognizes Princess Serena of Calith, the moderator announced, and suddenly every head in the chamber was turning toward her. Her mouth went dry. The words she'd been forming disappeared like smoke, and for one horrible moment she was certain she was about to make a complete fool of herself in front of representatives from 300 star systems. Then she caught Finn's eye and he made a small, encouraging gesture with his hand. "Go on, you've got this." And somehow that was enough. "Thank you, moderator," she said, pleased that her voice came out steady. The Calith system has operated independent mining and transport operations for 6 decades, serving a region largely outside major trade routes. We've found that flexible scheduling protocols and shared resource pools effectively address the speed disparity issues under discussion. Rather than fixed toll structures, we use a contribution-based system where slower vessels provide support services, navigational data, maintenance assistance, emergency response capabilities that benefit the entire network. It's not perfect, but it's kept 17 different species ships operating cooperatively in a fairly hostile region. She stopped, acutely aware that she'd just spoken for longer than most of these people had probably ever heard her name mentioned. The silence that followed felt enormous. Then the Terminus Prime representative, whose crystalline structure refracted light in patterns Serena had learned meant thoughtfulness, chimed in with a harmonic that the translation system rendered as, "This precedent merits examination. Does Calith maintain documentation of these protocols?" "Yes," Serena said, relief flooding through her. "I can provide data packets to any interested parties." "Please forward to the committee," the moderator said, and Serena heard in that simple instruction something she hadn't expected, her words being taken seriously. The session moved on to other topics, but something had shifted. When they broke for midday meal, 3 different delegates approached her table to request information about Calith's shipping protocols. The Silicon Collective envoy, who communicated through a device that turned electromagnetic impulses into sound, even made what Finn later informed her was probably a joke about solid-state solutions from solid people, which apparently passed for humor among beings who existed as organized crystal lattices. Finn walked with her toward the garden level, where the station's environmental engineers had somehow coaxed plants from 40 different worlds to coexist in spherical growth pods that floated through carefully controlled airspace. They found a relatively quiet corner near a cluster of andromedan orchids that bloomed in colors Serena's eyes couldn't quite process. "See," Finn said, settling onto a bench that adjusted to accommodate their different preferences for seat height and firmness. "You had something worth saying. You made me say it." "I made you nothing. I just reminded you that you were allowed to." He pulled out a ration pack from his jacket pocket and examined it with deep suspicion. Do you think protein synthesis block means it used to be food or hopes to become food? I think it means you should probably eat somewhere else. Probably, but I'm comfortable here. He took an experimental bite and made a face that suggested his fears had been justified. Your system really does independent mining. That's not just diplomatic padding. We do. Started out of necessity. The major corporations weren't interested in our asteroid belt because the yields weren't high enough for their operation costs. So we developed our own techniques, smaller scale but more efficient for what we have. It's not glamorous work, but it keeps our economy functional, which is more than a lot of systems can say. Finn had given up on the protein block and was now drinking something from a flask he'd produced from another pocket. Half the delegates in that chamber represent systems that are essentially economic vassals to larger powers. The fact that you've maintained independence, even on a small scale, is actually impressive. Serena felt warmth spread through her chest at the casual compliment, delivered like it was simple fact rather than flattery. My father would say it's stubbornness rather than strategy. Sometimes those are the same thing. Finn offered her the flask. It's water, I promise, earth water, but still. She accepted it and took a sip, tasting something faintly mineral that reminded her of home. Around them, the garden hummed with environmental systems and the quiet conversations of other delegates who'd sought refuge from the morning's tedium. A group of wrecks were examining a floating moss colony with what looked like genuine interest, and somewhere above them, something was singing in ultrasonic frequencies that Serena could feel more than hear. This afternoon is bilateral meetings, Finn said, consulting his schedule. I've got to explain to the hegemony why humans keep using sports metaphors in treaty language, and they should probably stop interpreting level playing field as a demand for planetary terraforming. What's on your agenda? Serena pulled up her own schedule and felt her brief moment of confidence falter. Nothing. I'm assigned to general attendance, which means I sit in observation areas and watch other people conduct actual business. That's ridiculous. You just demonstrated you have practical experience with issues they're actively debating. I'm from Calith, Finn. We don't get bilateral meetings unless someone mistakes our system for somewhere else. She tried to keep her tone light but heard the bitterness creep in anyway. Finn was quiet for a moment, turning his flask in his hands. Then he said, You know what the problem is with people like me. Cultural attachés, I mean. We spend so much time studying everyone else's customs and values that we forget the most important one, which is that how you treat someone says more about you than it does about them. He stood up, brushing imaginary dust from his jacket. The hegemony meeting isn't until 1400. Before that, I'm supposed to have an informal consultation with a few smaller system representatives about trade language standardization. You should come. Finn, I wasn't invited. You are now, I'm inviting you, as an expert consultant on independent system trade protocols. He grinned at her startled expression. What? You just proved you're qualified. Besides, I legitimately could use your input, and my job is to make sure the right people are talking to each other. Seems like you're the right people. Before Serena could formulate an argument, her datapad chimed with an incoming message. She glanced down and saw a formal request for materials. 3 different delegations asking for detailed information about Calith's shipping protocols, along with requests for follow-up consultations. Her hands trembled slightly as she read through them. Finn, she said slowly, I think people are actually interested. Of course they are, you gave them something useful. He checked his chronometer. We've got 45 minutes before that consultation meeting. Enough time for you to grab actual food, not protein blocks, I'm not that cruel, and for me to send some messages to the right people. Think you can handle a few hours of people actually wanting your opinion? Serena looked up at him, this human who'd wandered into her isolation and somehow decided she deserved better. and felt something uncurl in her chest that she hadn't realized had been wound tight for years. "I think I can manage." "Good, because honestly, I have no idea what half these trade terms actually mean in practice, and I was really hoping you'd bail me out." He extended his hand to help her up, and she took it, letting him pull her to her feet. As they walked back toward the station's central levels, Serena caught their reflection in one of the polished metal panels. A human cultural attaché in a rumpled jacket, and a princess from a minor system with elongated ears, walking side by side like they had every right to be exactly where they were. For the first time since arriving at Celestial Station, she thought maybe they did. The observation lounge at 2 in the morning, station time, was Serena's favorite discovery of the past week. The circular room wrapped around one of Celestial Station's minor spires, its walls pure transparency that offered an unobstructed view of the cosmos beyond. At this hour, with most delegates either sleeping or engaged in whatever political maneuvering passed for evening entertainment, the lounge was blessedly empty, except for the soft hum of environmental systems and the distant, almost subliminal vibration of the station's massive gyroscopes maintaining its orientation. She'd come here 3 nights running now, unable to sleep through the strange combination of exhilaration and anxiety that had become her constant companion. The days had transformed into something she barely recognized: meetings, consultations, actual substantive conversations with delegates who knew her name and sought her input. The Vrex Confederation had formally requested a partnership discussion about mining techniques. A coalition of 7 minor systems wanted her advice on forming a cooperative trade network. Even the Crystalline Accord had invited her to a session on sustainable resource extraction, which Finn had assured her was the equivalent of being asked to sit at the popular table in the cafeteria, if the popular table was made of sentient silicon and communicated through harmonic resonance. It was overwhelming. It was wonderful. It was terrifying in ways she hadn't anticipated. The door whispered open behind her and she turned, expecting a cleaning construct. Instead, Finn entered carrying 2 cups and looking as exhausted as she felt. "I had a 50-50 shot you'd be here," he said, crossing to where she stood at the viewport. "You're developing predictable patterns. As your unofficial advisor, I feel obligated to mention that predictability is dangerous in politics. As my unofficial advisor, you're supposed to be sleeping. Don't you have that hegemony session tomorrow about metaphor reduction in treaty language?" "In 6 hours, yes, and I've prepared by accepting that it's going to be a disaster regardless of how much sleep I get." He handed her one of the cups. "Station Synthesis Approximation of Caliph Tea. The food processors have your preferences on file now, which either means you've achieved notable status or the AI is getting sentimental. I'm hoping for both." Serena accepted the cup and inhaled the steam, surprised by how close the approximation actually was, sharp and slightly bitter with an undertone of something almost floral. "You didn't have to bring me tea at 2 in the morning. I was already awake and making some for myself, and I figured you'd be here brooding productively about whatever's keeping you from sleep." He settled into one of the adaptive chairs, which immediately adjusted to human specifications. "Want to talk about it, or should we just stare at the void in companionable silence?" She sipped the tea, buying time while she organized thoughts that had been circling through her mind for days. "I received an invitation this evening. Ambassador Kelrix of the Hegemony of 9 Suns wants to meet with me tomorrow afternoon. Private consultation about regional stability initiatives." Finn's expression shifted, something sharp and assessing flickering across his features before settling back into casual interest. "Kelrix himself? That's significant." "That's what worries me." Serena turned back to the viewport, watching a transport vessel glide past in the distance, its running lights tracing a path against the stars. 3 weeks ago, I couldn't have gotten Kelrix to acknowledge my existence if I'd set myself on fire in front of him. Now he wants a private consultation. Why? Because you've made yourself relevant. You've demonstrated expertise, built connections, proven you're more than your system's modest reputation suggested. Finn paused. You don't sound happy about that. I'm thrilled about it. I'm also not naive about it. She faced him again, wrapping both hands around the warm cup. The hegemony doesn't meet with minor system representatives out of newfound respect for our potential. They meet with us when they want something or when we've become inconvenient. I'd like to know which category I fall into. Maybe both. You've been proposing alternatives to frameworks that benefit major powers at smaller systems' expense. That makes you useful to some factions and problematic to others. Finn drank his own tea, his gaze distant in a way that suggested he was running through political calculations. What's your instinct telling you? That I'm about to be offered something that sounds generous but isn't. Good instinct. What are you going to do about it? Serena laughed, a short, sharp sound. That's the question that's keeping me awake. Say no and risk offending one of the most powerful entities in this sector. Say yes and risk becoming whatever they want me to become. There's no winning move. Sure there is. You go to the meeting. You listen to what Kelrix proposes. And then you make a decision based on what serves Calith's actual interest rather than what makes anyone else comfortable. Finn set his cup down on the small table between their chairs. You've been doing that all week. Why stop now? Because this week I've been making suggestions in open sessions, where the worst that happens is people ignore me. This is different. The hegemony doesn't make idle overtures. No, they don't. Which means Kelrix thinks you're someone worth approaching, and that should tell you something about the position you've built here. Finn leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Serena, when you first sat down at that table at the opening banquet, how many delegates knew your name? Possibly none. And now, she considered, more than I expected. Less than I'd like. Wrong answer. Now you've got major powers requesting private meetings, minor systems seeking your advice, and at least 3 proposals working through committees that incorporate your suggestions. You've changed the calculation, and that's making some people nervous and others opportunistic. Both of those are better than being invisible. Is this the part where you warn me to be careful? This is the part where I remind you that being careful doesn't mean being small. He stood and walked to the viewport, standing beside her. The hegemony plays a long game. If Kelrix is reaching out, it's because he sees 10 moves ahead and thinks you're a piece worth positioning. That's not a threat unless you let it be. Comforting. It wasn't meant to be comforting, it was meant to be accurate. He grinned suddenly. Though I'll admit the metaphor was mixed. 10 moves ahead, but you're a piece. I'm getting sloppy with my imagery. The hegemony would be appalled. Despite herself, Serena smiled. You're terrible at reassurance. I'm excellent at reassurance. I'm just not doing that right now. Right now, I'm reminding you that 3 weeks ago you would have been grateful for any attention from someone like Kelrix, and now you're skeptical of his motives. That's growth. That's exactly the mindset you need. A ship was docking at one of the station's lower ports, the flare of its maneuvering thrusters briefly painting the observation lounge in orange light. Serena watched the distant dance of approach and alignment, thinking about trajectories and corrections, and the constant adjustments required to reach your destination without colliding with everything else in motion around you. The coalition of minor systems, she said slowly. The ones who asked about forming a cooperative network, they're meeting again tomorrow morning. I was going to attend. And now you're thinking you shouldn't because Kelrix might see it as choosing sides. The thought had occurred to me. Finn made a show of considering this. Here's a radical idea. What if you attend the coalition meeting because it's genuinely useful for Calith's interests, and then meet with Kelrix afterward because that's also potentially useful, and trust that you're capable of navigating both without compromising your actual goals? What if those goals end up being incompatible? Then you deal with that when it happens, but making yourself smaller preemptively because you're afraid of future conflicts is just invisible again with extra steps. He turned to face her fully. You know what I think scares you more than Kelrix's attention? What? That you've realized you're good at this. That you actually might be able to build something meaningful here. And that means you can't hide behind the excuse that your kingdom's irrelevance makes you irrelevant. You matter now, and that's harder than not mattering because now you have something to lose. The observation lounge's environmental system cycled, adjusting atmospheric composition by fractions of a percent that Serena's biology couldn't consciously detect, but that some deeper part of her registered as the station taking a breath. Finn was watching her with that particular expression he got sometimes, the one that saw through whatever diplomatic face she was wearing to something underneath. "I hate that you're right," she said finally. "I'm rarely right about anything important. I'm just loud about my guesses." He picked up his empty cup. "You should sleep. Tomorrow's going to be complicated regardless of what you decide, and you'll handle it better with at least a few hours of unconsciousness." "You're leaving." "I have to review 17 pages of treaty language to figure out which sports metaphors are causing international incidents. Did you know that stepping up to the plate translates in Vrex as ascending to the ritual combat circle? We've accidentally been challenging people to duels for 6 months." He paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I think you should attend the coalition meeting, not because it's the safe choice, but because it's the right one. And then meet with Kelrix and show him exactly who he's decided to approach, someone who makes her own decisions." After he left, Serena remained at the viewport for another hour, drinking tea that had gone cold and watching ships arrive and depart in the eternal traffic of a station that never truly slept. She thought about trajectories and choices and the difference between being moved and moving yourself. By the time she finally returned to her quarters, she'd made her decision. The coalition meeting was at 900 hours. She would attend. And then she would meet Ambassador Kelrix at 1400 hours, and he would discover that the minor system princess he decided to notice had no intention of being anyone's convenient piece in anyone's game but her own. She slept for 4 hours and woke feeling like she'd been granted a weapon she hadn't known she needed. The certainty that whatever happened next, she would face it as herself, not as whoever others expected her to be. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, exactly the way she was beginning to understand everything worth doing felt. The emergency session had been called at midnight, which meant everyone was operating on insufficient sleep and maximum anxiety, never a good combination for preventing interstellar incidents. Serena sat in Summit Chamber 1, the largest venue on Celestial Station, watching the holographic display cycle through territorial maps of the disputed asteroid belt that bordered her own system. The images rotated slowly, each colored overlay representing a different power's claim to jurisdiction, and the overlapping zones created a visual mess that accurately reflected the political situation. 4 major factions claimed rights to the belt. The hegemony cited historical exploration records from 2 centuries prior. The Vrex Confederation pointed to current mining operations established 15 years ago. A coalition of corporate interests insisted their commercial investment gave them administrative authority. And a regional defense pact argued that strategic necessity trumped everyone else's claims. None of them would yield without losing face, and military vessels from 3 of the 4 parties were currently positioned uncomfortably close to each other in the disputed space. Finn, seated 2 rows behind her with the Earth delegation, had sent a message to her datapad an hour into the presentations. "Remember when we thought shipping regulations were boring? I'd like to formally apologize to shipping regulations." She'd suppressed a smile then, but now, 4 hours into circular arguments and escalating rhetoric, even Finn's humor couldn't penetrate the weight of what was happening. This wasn't abstract politics anymore. This was the sharp edge where diplomacy failed and people started dying. The moderator called for a recess at 0400 hours, and Serena stood on legs that had gone numb from sitting. The chamber emptied in clusters. major powers gravitating toward each other for hurried consultations, minor systems lingering uncertainly at the edges. She was making her way toward the exit when Ambassador Kelrix materialized at her elbow. His bioluminescent patterns cycling through what she'd learned indicated urgent business. "Princess Serena, a word if you have a moment." She'd been expecting this since the session began. The disputed belt bordered Calith's territory, which made her system technically adjacent to the crisis, without being directly involved. The perfect position for someone looking to use her as a proxy. "Of course, Ambassador." He guided her to one of the private consultation alcoves off the main corridor, spaces designed for exactly these sorts of impromptu negotiations. Once the privacy field activated, creating a bubble of sound dampening around them, Kelrix's demeanor shifted from diplomatic courtesy to something more calculating. "The hegemony is prepared to offer Calith's system favorable trade status in the Nine Suns markets," he said without preamble. "Reduced tariffs, priority docking rights, access to our commercial networks. Quite generous terms for a system of your size. In exchange for your support for our territorial claim." A statement from Calith regarding historical precedent in the region would carry weight precisely because you're not a major power. Neutral observer supporting our position. Serena kept her expression carefully blank while her mind raced. It was exactly what she'd predicted during that late-night conversation with Finn. An offer that sounded generous but came with strings that would turn her into exactly what she'd feared. The hegemony wanted to use Calith's neutrality as cover for their own interests, and in exchange they'd offer economic benefits that her kingdom desperately needed. A month ago, she would have been tempted. A week ago, she might have been flattered. Now she recognized it for what it was, an attempt to purchase her relevance and redirect it towards someone else's goals. "That's a substantial offer," she said carefully. "May I ask what the hegemony's response would be if Calith were to propose an alternative solution?" Kelrix's patterns flickered in a way she'd learned meant surprise. "An alternative. The belt borders my system. I've spent the past 4 hours listening to arguments about historical claims and commercial investment and strategic positioning, and no one has mentioned the most obvious approach." She pulled up her datapad and displayed the territorial maps she'd been studying since the crisis began. "A consortium. All parties maintain presence, contributions and returns distributed proportionally based on documented historical and current investment. Calith administers the operations as neutral arbiter, using our existing protocols for multi-party resource sharing. You're suggesting the hegemony share control with corporate interests and the Vrex. I'm suggesting everyone gets what they actually need: access to resources and security against military escalation, without anyone having to admit they lost the political argument. It's the same framework we use in our own region. It works because no one feels they've been excluded." She met his eyes, or what passed for them given his physiology. And Calith would be honored to serve as administrator, naturally for a small administrative fee that would benefit all parties by ensuring neutral oversight. The silence stretched long enough that Serena wondered if she'd overplayed her hand. Then Kelrix's pattern cycled through a sequence she couldn't interpret, and he said, "You've thought this through. I've had 4 hours and detailed knowledge of similar situations. It's not a perfect solution, but it prevents the imperfect solution where people start shooting at each other. The hegemony would need to review. Of course, I plan to present it when session resumes. I wanted to inform you first out of courtesy, since you were kind enough to offer Calith your support." She smiled slightly. "Though I hope the hegemony would find this proposal worthy of consideration even without our prior conversation." Kelrix studied her for a long moment, and Serena had the distinct impression she was being recalculated in his strategic assessments. Finally, he said, "You are not what I expected, Princess. I get that a lot lately." When she emerged from the alcove, Finn was leaning against the corridor wall with the casual posture of someone who definitely hadn't been waiting anxiously to make sure she was all right. "So, how'd it go with our luminescent friend?" "I either just made a brilliant political move or committed career suicide. Possibly both. Those are basically the same thing at this level." He fell into step beside her as they walked toward the observation deck where several delegates had gathered during the recess. "Want to tell me about it, or should I wait for the dramatic reveal when session resumes?" She explained her proposal in quick, quiet sentences, watching his expression shift from curiosity to something like pride. When she finished, he was grinning. "That's either going to work beautifully or explode spectacularly, and I genuinely can't predict which." "Comforting." "It wasn't meant to be comforting. It was meant to be accurate." "Yes, I know your speech." They'd reached the observation deck, where clusters of delegates were engaged in urgent discussions that fell silent when Serena entered. She felt the weight of attention, the calculations being made about what role the minor system princess might play in resolving this crisis. The coalition of smaller systems she'd been advising was gathered near the viewport, and when they saw her, Ambassador Tevik of Sendara detached from the group and approached. "Princess Serena, we've been discussing the situation. If you're planning to propose intervention from Caliph, the coalition would like to formally support your position." She glanced at Finn, who raised his eyebrows. "This is your moment," and she turned back to Tevik. "I appreciate that. I'll be proposing a consortium approach that would benefit from multi-system administrative support. If the coalition is interested in participating, I think we could build something substantial." More delegates were drifting over now, drawn by the sense that something was coalescing. The Vrex representative, a corporate liaison, even the crystalline accord observer, resonating at frequencies that suggested heightened interest. Within minutes, Serena found herself at the center of an impromptu negotiation session, delegates firing questions about resource distribution, administrative oversight, security guarantees. She answered them drawing on years of watching her father manage their own modest operations. On the protocols she'd spent a week explaining to anyone who'd listen. On the confidence that had been building since a human attaché sat beside her at a banquet and treated her like she mattered. When the moderator called them back to session at 0600 hours, Serena had commitments from 7 systems to support her proposal and tentative interest from 2 of the 4 major claimants. She requested time to address the chamber, and this time when she stood, she didn't feel the flutter of anxiety that had accompanied her first public statement. This time she knew exactly what she was doing. She presented the consortium framework in clear, practical terms, how it would function, who would benefit, why it prevented conflict while preserving everyone's core interests. She showed data from Caliph's own operations proving the model worked at scale. She addressed objections before they were raised and invited collaboration on implementation details. And when Ambassador Kelrix rose to speak, she braced for dismissal and instead heard. The hegemony finds merit in this proposal and would be willing to engage in good faith negotiations regarding its implementation. The Vrex followed, then the corporate coalition. Within an hour, what had been an intractable crisis was becoming a framework for cooperation, and Serena was being discussed as its architect. They broke at 0900 for final consultations, and Finn intercepted her in the corridor with 2 cups of coffee and a look of undisguised delight. "So, how does it feel to possibly have just prevented a war?" "Terrifying, exhausting, completely surreal." She accepted the coffee and drank deeply. "Do you think it'll actually work?" "I think you gave everyone permission to back down without losing face, which is basically diplomatic sorcery. Whether they take it depends on factors beyond your control, but you've done the impossible part. You made cooperation look stronger than conflict." He clicked his cup against hers in the earth gesture of celebration. "Also, you just made Caliph relevant in a way that's going to last well beyond this summit. Minor systems are going to look at what you built here and realize they don't have to accept invisibility. That's going to make some major powers nervous, and others start paying real attention to who you are. I'm not sure that's entirely positive. It's not. It's also not irrelevant anymore, which was the alternative. He glanced at his chronometer. They're going to vote on preliminary acceptance of your framework in an hour. You should eat something besides coffee and possibly sit down before you fall down. I should make sure the coalition representatives have the support documentation they requested. And I need to send updates to my father. He's going to want to know his kingdom just became a lot more complicated. Do those things later. Right now, come sit in the observation lounge for 20 minutes and process the fact that you just accomplished something remarkable. Serena let him guide her through the corridors to their familiar refuge, the stars beyond the transparent walls offering their ancient, indifferent perspective on the small dramas of temporary beings. She settled into her usual chair, feeling the adrenaline that had carried her through the session beginning to ebb, leaving behind exhaustion and something else, satisfaction, maybe, or the beginning of it. When I sat at that table at the opening banquet, she said quietly, I was so certain everyone was right to ignore me, that I had nothing to offer, that I was just taking up space until I could go home and tell my father I'd attended like a good representative should. And now I think maybe I was always worth listening to. I just needed someone to hear me first. She looked at him, this improbable friend who'd transformed her entire summit experience by the simple act of sitting beside her. Thank you, Finn, for treating me like I mattered before I remembered I did. I didn't do anything special. I just sat next to someone who looked like they could use company and discovered they were exactly as interesting as everyone should have realized from the start. He stretched, joints popping audibly. Though I will take partial credit for encouraging you to speak up, that part was solid advice. Partial credit, how generous. I'm a generous person. It's one of my best qualities, along with persistence, charm, and a complete inability to recognize when I should stop talking. The vote, when it came, wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. The framework passed with sufficient support to move forward, and Caliph was formally designated as administrative coordinator pending final negotiations. Serena received messages from 30 different delegations congratulating her, requesting meetings, proposing collaborations. Her father sent a terse communication that said simply, "Well done," which from him constituted effusive praise. On the last night of the summit, she stood at the observation lounge viewport watching her ship prepare for departure, feeling the weight of everything that had changed. She wasn't the same person who'd arrived 2 weeks ago, uncertain and invisible. She'd found her voice, built alliances, proven that size didn't determine significance. She was returning home to a kingdom that would face new challenges and opportunities in equal measure, and she was ready for both. Finn appeared beside her one last time, carrying farewell gifts she suspected, 2 more cups of terrible station coffee. So, Princess of Caliph, administrator of a multi-system resource consortium, person who accidentally became relevant. How does it feel? Like I should be terrified, but I'm mostly excited. Is that normal? Probably not, but I've never been normal, so I'm the wrong person to ask. He handed her a cup. You're going to do extraordinary things, Serena. This was just the beginning. What about you? Back to explaining metaphors and preventing accidental declarations of war. Someone has to do it. Besides, I've discovered I'm good at noticing people everyone else overlooks. Might make it my specialty. He raised his cup in salute, to remembering you were never unwanted, just unnoticed, and to making damn sure nobody overlooks you again. She touched her cup to his, feeling the warmth of coffee and friendship, and the strange, wonderful certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. To new beginnings, and to humans who sit beside princesses like their queens. You are a queen, Serena. You always were. I just had the good sense to grab the seat next to you before anyone else figured it out. Her ship's departure was announced over the station-wide system. Time to go home. Time to begin the next chapter of whatever she was becoming. She turned from the viewport, shoulders straight and head high, carrying herself with the authority she'd finally claimed as her own. Behind her, the stars burned on, indifferent and eternal, bearing witness to one more story of someone who'd learned they mattered, because one person had taken the time to show them they always had.